I couldn't believe I shouted those words at him. The words just came out of my mouth before I could stop myself. I was standing there in the driveway of my house. My face was bright red and I was pointing at him like I was some kind of lunatic. His wife stood there right next to him with their 2 kids, and all of them were looking at me as if I'd completely lost my mind. I suppose I had in that moment. I'd completely lost it. The word I used was one I knew meant something to Thai people, and it might have been one of the worst insults I could have thrown at him. But in the moment, I couldn't control myself. I could imagine how it looked from the outside. This Farang who'd gone to their country and was screaming at him because of his dogs barking all night. I felt sick in the moment I said it, a really bad feeling inside, and I could see it in their faces, the shock and the disgust, and the way his wife took the kids inside while he just stood there looking at me as if he was deciding whether to hit me or walk away. He chose to walk away. I went back inside and sat on the sofa and thought about what I'd become. This was me. I'd never been a person like this. Back in Australia, I'd been a teacher for over 20 years, starting out when I was 21, fresh out of university. I felt idealistic, like I was there to make a difference. But by the time I hit 41, I was done with it all. The kids didn't respect teachers anymore, the parents blamed us for everything, and the rules kept changing all the time. My worst days were in the classrooms, dealing with the kids who would tell you to F off to your face. But even with all that, I'd never lost it like this before. I'd never been this angry, never was someone who would scream at somebody like I did then. That moment in the driveway was rock bottom for me, standing there in Thailand. I'd been in Thailand for 6 years. I'd left everything behind to start fresh, and I'd turned into someone I didn't recognize anymore, and I was ashamed of what I had become. When I was teaching in Australia, it really wore me down, bit by bit, year after year, and I became even more jaded as time went by. I can remember one day very clearly, around 2002, when I'd been teaching for about 5 years and a kid threw a chair right at me. He picked it up like it was nothing and hurled it across the classroom because I'd asked him to do something. And it was one of those schools where the parents paid money, so the head teacher even had me apologising to the kid's parents for upsetting him. I persevered through the years of similar incidents, although none were quite as bad as that. But it wasn't just the violence or the disrespect, it was everything. There was always paperwork to do, endless box ticking and constant inspections where someone would come around and tell you everything you were doing wrong. The pay wasn't brilliant either, and after 20 years in the job it felt like a career, the amount I was earning, yet it felt like it wasn't worth it, because it wasn't actually a career if I couldn't even have a life from it. I could never afford to buy a house, which was something I always wanted. I couldn't afford a good car and had to settle for a very bad one. And going on holiday wasn't a yearly event for me. It was every 3 years if I was lucky. By the time I was 41 years old, I had nothing to show for 20 years of hard work. And that was when I started looking online for teaching jobs abroad. I always had to mark papers when I was at home because I was too busy during the day. So I would sit at my computer marking them and look at all those signs that advertised jobs from places like Dubai, Singapore, Hong Kong, China, and even Thailand. It seemed like places like that actually valued their teachers. You might even be able to save some money and have a good life. Hong Kong was the place that kept coming up to me the most. They had great salaries there, proper international schools, and respect for education. I actually applied for 5 jobs there, and I was offered 3, and the one I took was at an international school teaching English to secondary students. The salary was far more than I was earning at home, but it wasn't just about the money, it was everything. As soon as I was offered the job, I gave minimum notice that I was required and walked away, ready to start something new. I'd given 20 years of my life and had nothing to show from it, apart from the experience I was able to take somewhere else where I hoped I would be valued more. It was an exciting time, and I was looking forward to a new challenge. As soon as I arrived in Hong Kong, I knew immediately that it was the best decision I'd ever made. It was so different to Australia, and all the differences seemed to be what made it as good as it was. Everyone and everything was moving all the time, nobody stood still, and everyone had somewhere to be, and the whole city was just alive in a way that I'd never witnessed before. The school where I was going to work put me up in a serviced apartment for the first month until I found my own place, and it was nicer than anywhere I'd ever lived before, although it was very small. It even had a pool on the roof and a gym in the basement, and someone came to clean the room every single day. The school itself was amazing. The kids wore proper uniforms, they stood up when you walked in, and they even called you sir without any undertones of sarcasm, and they were completely different to the students I was used to back home. The resources at the school were incredible as well. It was an international school, and therefore expensive to send kids to, but the facilities were shocking to me at first about how good they were. There were teachers from all over the world, quite a few from England, some from Canada, a few from South Africa, and one from the States. Once I got to know them, we started going out for drinks at night, but that was when the other side of Hong Kong showed itself. Everything was so expensive. That serviced apartment they put me up in at the start, anything similar to that was going to cost a sickening amount of money if I had to rent it myself. Even with the salary I was on, after I'd paid for everything, I was just about living. I wasn't saving as much as I'd hoped, and the cost of everything was crazy. Everything was expensive, decent meals, and yes, you could find things cheaper, but never to my taste. The place I finally rented was tiny, and what I had back at home was huge in comparison. The bathroom was so small you could barely turn around in it, and the kitchen was so cramped you could reach from one wall to the other with your palms flat against them. It was that small. It was also extremely expensive, and after a year I might have saved $1,000 at most. That just didn't feel like it was enough, regardless of how much I loved it there. A better salary, but it was crazy expensive, and you were living in something smaller than a shoebox. I wasn't thinking about leaving the job yet, but I didn't think I would be able to sustain it for a long time, because I couldn't save any money. And after another 6 months went by, I'd been in Hong Kong for around 18 months in total, when I went with some of the other teachers to Shenzhen, just over the border in mainland China. They definitely weren't wrong about it. We stayed in a 5-star hotel that cost a fraction of what a similar place would have cost in Hong Kong, and we had a massive feast of a meal for less than the equivalent across the border. It felt different to Hong Kong, really different, but I couldn't believe how much more affordable everything was. One of the teachers I was with said he had a friend working in Shanghai who made decent money, but the most important thing was he could save a lot as well, and that really got me thinking. If I could even make half of what I made in Hong Kong, but I made it in China, where everything was so cheap, I would be earning less but saving more, and that started to pique my interest. When I got back, I started looking properly, and just like in Hong Kong, there were lots of international schools in China desperate for native English-speaking teachers. The salaries weren't as high as they were in Hong Kong, but you could rent a place for a fraction of the cost. Meals and everything else were far cheaper, and it all made a lot of sense. I applied to a few places and managed to get an offer from a school about 2 hours out of Shanghai. I'm not going to pretend I wasn't nervous about it, because this was something altogether different to Hong Kong. This was mainland China. The school agreed to fly me out to have a look before I made up my mind. The campus was huge, full of great facilities with a swimming pool, football pitches and everything, and then they showed me the flat I would be able to live in, which was 3 times the size of my place in Hong Kong, and it was far cheaper. So I took the job. The teaching itself in China was a lot harder work. The kids were really disciplined, which was good, but it was in a different way. They could memorize everything that I told them, but they didn't think for themselves like they did in Hong Kong. You could tell them something and they just did it, but when you asked for their opinions, they would give you nothing, just staring at you strangely. The hours were brutal as well. I started at 7:30 in the morning and the school day went until 5, And then there was evening study sessions that lasted until 9 that I was expected to be around for. While I didn't have to stay through all of them, it was still a pressure to show my face and to run extra classes and to prove that I was committed. I was committed, but this was a workload I'd never experienced. There were some proper teachers there like me, but I also noticed plenty of people teaching who really shouldn't have been, people who were just there because they wanted the visa or didn't have a better idea. After 3 years working in China, I'd managed to save around $30,000, and that felt like a big achievement. But I was absolutely worn out, and the pollution was driving me insane, and some days you could not even see across the street. I'd developed a cough that would not go away, and my eyes were always irritated. It was difficult living in those conditions, and the internet restrictions were doing my head in as well. I had to use a VPN for everything, and even that would fail some of the time, so I couldn't easily watch anything. Couldn't read the news, and not even being able to use Google. That was crazy. I was also getting very lonely. I had a short relationship with a Chinese woman for a few months, but I never felt that I properly connected because people there seemed to focus on the end goal and they weren't interested in enjoying themselves. At least that's what it felt like. That's a very broad statement, but that's what felt true to me. And trying to make friends among the expats was hard because most of them were a lot younger. Most of them were teaching for beer money, it seemed, and while I was already in my mid-40s, I had a little in common with them, not as much as I would have liked. The Chinese teachers were friendly enough and invited me out sometimes, but there was always a barrier between us. They were polite and civil, but they weren't like proper friends. I always felt like just another foreign teacher on the outside. But then I'd been away from Australia for 4 years and I was missing my family. My sister had had another child I'd never met, and my dad had been diagnosed with an illness, which was very tough. I started thinking maybe it was time to go home. But the thought of returning to that life that I'd left behind and back to that pay and the classrooms and the kids, it didn't appeal to me. So I began looking at other options, in Southeast Asia mainly, from Vietnam, Malaysia, and Thailand. Thailand in particular kept rising right to the top because the international schools there sounded decent. Maybe they weren't Hong Kong salaries or China, but it was somewhere close, and the country itself was supposed to be a paradise. From beaches to sunshine and friendly people and brilliant food, with the cost of living lower than China, but without the pollution and the internet blocks. So I began reading about forums and joining groups about expat teachers working in Thailand, and everyone seemed to love it. They called it the land of smiles and saying it was the best decision they'd made by going there. Teaching there was meant to be relaxed, kids were meant to be respectful, and you could live very comfortably on a teacher's wage, which, to me, sounded perfect. Thailand sounded like it could be just what I needed, so I decided to fly to Bangkok when I next had a break from work. It was so different to China, and it was also very different to Hong Kong. The thing I noticed straight away was how different the people were. In China, people didn't speak English, and while not everyone in Thailand did, almost everyone you went, people spoke just enough for you to get by. Even the taxi driver spoke to me non-stop from the airport to the hotel, which was very different from what I was expecting. I was staying in the Silom area of Bangkok where I'd booked a hotel, and I'd heard that was along the SkyTrain route, so you could go anywhere in the city from there. It was meant to be a great area to look at. There seemed to be two sides to Thailand. You could walk out of your hotel and see street food absolutely everywhere, and right next to it there would be expensive restaurants. There seemed to be something on offer for everyone in Thailand, and that was the first impression I got on my first day there. That day I walked all around the area where I was staying, and I had to check out Pat Pong because I'd read about it online, and that was an experience I will never forget. But I was also there to look at schools. I'd already been in touch with schools searching for teachers, and I was actually interviewing with 3 of them. Because I was very experienced and a qualified professional teacher, I was in high demand, and each of the schools I visited, all international schools, offered me the job. One of them offered me a job on the spot, with a salary of about 100,000 baht, which when I worked it out, based on the cost of living, it seemed great. I took the job immediately. They said I was a perfect fit and even offered me a relocation allowance. Even though I was already in Thailand, I would have to go back to China to collect my things. It seemed like it was the best choice for me. I looked around at the places I could rent within my budget, and every single one of them was better than what I had in China, and the price was about the same. The school itself was not like the one in China. While they did have good facilities and the other teachers were great, it was not as big or as spread out because it was right in the middle of the city. I still got the feeling though it was a proper school, whereas in China it had felt more like a factory. I went back and told the school in China that I was leaving, and they said if I wanted to leave, that was fine. They didn't want me to work there anymore if I didn't want to. I thought that was decent. I had expected to stay for another month, but they told me not to bother, which meant I could go straight back to Thailand and spend a month getting used to the country before I started work. When I arrived back in Thailand, the school paid me the allowance they had agreed, and I found a one-bedroom condo within walking distance of the school. I had it worked out in my mind that this was third time lucky. I loved working in Hong Kong, but it was too expensive. I loved working in China, but it was such hard work all the time and I never felt connected to anyone there. But here in Thailand, it seemed like I was definitely going to be third time lucky for me. That condo in Bangkok was the nicest place I had ever lived. It wasn't huge, but it was modern and it had great facilities, and it was in such a good location. It was completely furnished throughout and I didn't need to buy anything, and it was so easy to rent. All you needed to do was look at it, say you wanted it, and pay the money, and then move in. I loved how simple it was. It even had 24-hour security, which surprised me at first because I never felt unsafe in Thailand. But it was just an extra thing to give you some kind of peace of mind, even if it was probably unnecessary. I found out later that the security guards also handled deliveries and things like that, so it wasn't just about the security. The school was only about 15 minutes away from the nearest BTS station, and my condo was somewhere between the two, probably a bit closer to the BTS, though I could still walk to school. It was hot when walking, but I didn't mind because it was fun, interesting and also exciting, and I felt like I fit in almost immediately. The kids at the school were, for the most part, very respectful, but they also had a personality which was different to how it had been in China. Some of them were genuinely interested in learning and asking questions I would never hear in China or in Hong Kong. When I started there, it felt great. The location and the school and the community and most of the teachers were in a similar position to me, professionals from back at home who had come out for a change. It was nothing like the schools you hear about that employ anyone who happens to be a native English speaker. This was a proper school, and I started to feel like moving to Thailand was the best decision I ever made. And when I had my first break and visited some beautiful beaches not far from Bangkok, that was when I felt like I'd finally found my place. I was managing to save money as well. Not quite as much as I could save in China, but I was still putting away maybe $1,000 a month, which I thought was great at the time. I could do things I would never have been able to afford back at home, and I decided to commit to learning Thai, taking private lessons in the evening 3 times a week. They only cost about 300 baht an hour as well, and after 6 months I could hold basic conversations and order food and chat with the taxi drivers and get by without needing to switch to English. I was fitting in well and I was loving everything about it. I really was enjoying myself in Thailand. I felt like I'd made a great decision and I found everything about it just that little bit better than both China and Hong Kong. I found places I liked to go the most, and one Friday evening, I was in a club along Ratchdapisek Road with some of my colleagues from work. I'd not had a girlfriend in Thailand yet, but a few of us were there drinking, and about 30 minutes after we arrived, a group of 4 Thai girls came and sat on the table next to us. It looked like they'd already been partying somewhere else and had had a few drinks, and after a few looks back and forth and quick smiles, we joined tables together and started talking. We were there for about 3 hours getting more drunk, and I started talking with one of the girls who seemed to be the shyest out of her group. The other teachers I was with told me they were leaving, but I barely noticed because I was too engrossed in the conversation. So I just said, take it easy and I'll see you on Monday. I stayed much longer with her, just talking and drinking, and before I realised what was happening, we were leaving together, sharing a taxi together, and then we were back at my place, which I'd not expected. From that moment on, I felt inseparable from her. She became my girlfriend and she made me feel like moving to Thailand was even better than I'd thought before. She left that next morning and my head was still spinning, thinking I couldn't believe what had happened. But we exchanged contact details and she sent me a message later that day asking if I wanted to go out again that evening. We went out, repeated the night before, and did the same on Sunday. On Monday, we both had work. She told me that she worked in an office, but we arranged to meet up that evening. We ended up seeing each other every day for at least 2 weeks, and soon she was telling me that she loved me and wanted to be my girlfriend. It was quick, but we were already talking about living together. She said her place that she worked was near Ratchadare, and that was quite a long way from where I lived, and I needed to stay close to school. But I was falling for her hard, and that told me to make me think that I needed to move in with her. And then I said, if you did, I would cover your transport costs to work. She was 24, which was younger than me, but she seemed mature for her age. She knew what she wanted in life, and she had her head screwed on, and even though it was fast, I wanted her to move in as quickly as possible. After a year of living together, we got married. We did it at the district office and then had a big party with her family in Buriram, where she was from. And her parents, although seeming unsure at first, because I did everything the Thai way, I think they respected me for that. And they knew I had a proper job and a work permit and a visa, and I think that to them that made it acceptable. I was not going to mention this, but after she'd been living with me for a month, she stopped working, saying it was too far to travel, so I supported her. I thought about leaving that part out, but the truth was, I found out about a month after we married that she never actually worked in an office. She'd worked in a bar, and the night we wed, she'd just finished her shift and gone out with the other girls from the bar. I didn't know until after I was with her already, but I chose to ignore it because I didn't think it mattered and we were happy together. When she moved in, she was lying about going to work and then she stopped, but it wasn't actually stopping. It was just that she'd never been working in the first place, and it was easier for her to stay with me, so I just put up with it and accepted it for what it was. The first few months of my married life, even the first 6 months to a year, were some of the best times I'd ever had. I was managing to put money away every month, and it felt like after we'd been together for a year, the next step should be to buy our own place. One of the big problems about buying property in Thailand as a foreigner is you cannot own the land the house sits on. You can buy a condo, but I was thinking about this place as my forever home, and I didn't want to live in a condo when I was older. If you want to buy a house, you have to put it in the name of a Thai person. You could get a lease or for 30 years, or you could try to set it up through a Thai company, but that didn't seem very safe. The problem was, though, that I didn't have enough cash to buy the house outright without a mortgage. Because of that, I couldn't arrange a lease or anything else. So we started looking for houses with my savings as the deposit and the mortgage in my wife's name, and I would pay it off. We wanted a proper house with a garden, somewhere with a community pool and a gym, and I wanted to have an area outside because I wanted to be able to spend time outside. Between the money I'd saved in China and the money I'd saved working in Thailand, I probably had around 40,000 Australian dollars, which was about 25% of the price of a house, probably actually a bit less. And we were looking at getting a 20-year mortgage that I hoped to pay off quicker. We spent about 3 months looking at different developments, and while they were a long way from the school in terms of my commute, maybe 45 minutes each way, it seemed like that was what I would want to do and what I would have to do because it would be better for the future. We picked a house that cost 6 million baht, a 3-bedroom detached place on a development, and we were approved for the mortgage in my wife's name. After being in Thailand for about 16 months, we had our own place, and I felt like it was just a matter of paying off the mortgage, saving up a bit more, and then retiring. Life looked great, and the future looked great, and I felt like I owed it all to Thailand. I knew it was a big risk putting the house in her name, but there was also a mortgage being paid on it and she couldn't afford to cover it herself, so I took that as a good form of security. I didn't feel like I was doing anything stupid, and although I had heard plenty of horror stories from other expats, guys who had bought houses for their Thai wives and lost everything, I didn't think that was going to happen to me. Even though I found out that she lied slightly about what she was doing when we first met, I didn't care about that anymore because I was happy that we were together, and life just seemed to be getting better. After a year of being in the house, I bought a car. I gave up using the cheap motorcycle I had before, and I had to get finance on that, but I could do that in my own name. I was working very hard, putting in extra hours and paying back as much as I could for both the car and the house, so I could reach the point where I no longer had any debt. It was my plan to live in Thailand forever. I didn't want to go back to renting, and I had no intention of ever going back to Australia, so I really felt this was the best choice for us. By this point, 4 years had gone by, and I'd never had any problems with my wife, never had any problems with anything in Thailand, and I was loving everything about life there. I think by then I'd already paid off about half of the mortgage and about half of the car loan, and life was looking good. I really felt there was nothing that could go wrong, but I suppose everyone feels that way until something does, and when it happens, it's how you deal with it that decides whether it's going to become your failure or salvation. What started to happen then was something that I'd never thought possible. You can be as careful as you like, crossing the T's and dotting the I's, being as cautious as anyone in the world, and yet something can still crop up that makes you feel like nothing will ever be right again. The house that we bought was on a brand new development. Half of it was still under construction, but that was a long way away from where our house was, and there were still people moving into houses for quite a long time after we moved in. After we'd been there for approximately 6 months, a really nice Thai family moved in next door to us, and we became quite friendly with them. The man was a little older than me, his wife was a little bit older than my wife, and they had 2 kids. It was not like we were close to them or going around to each other's houses all the time, but every time I was outside and they were outside, we would say hi, and we never had any problems with them at all. They were some of the friendliest and kindest people I'd ever seen, and it was really great to be in such an amazing community. A few years later, in fact, that was when we had people moving into the house on the other side to us, and that was when things started to go badly wrong. The day they moved in, the day they brought the dogs with them, yes, dogs as a plural, 4 of them, those rat-like dogs that never shut up, and it was clear from the start that they were not trained properly. To start with, I thought, like any reasonable person would think, that they were just getting used to the new house and this family had moved in and husband, wife and kids, but the dogs were relentless. There was not any peace during the first few days of being there, but I was still letting it go because I thought it would die down eventually, but it never did. A few days later, I said to him, being very polite, "Your dogs bark a lot, don't they?" This guy spoke English, so I could speak to him. Even though my Thai was getting better, it wasn't great yet, but it was getting there. But he just laughed, saying it was good for security. How anyone was going to be frightened of such hideous rat-like dogs, I don't know, but he was completely oblivious to the fact that these dogs were ruining my existence. They left the dogs outside at night and they barked all the time, and that went on for ages and it never stopped. I'm not saying they barked relentlessly for 12 hours in a row. They were just barking, and barking about every 30 minutes. One would start up and then they'd all start and I'd get woken up. That was very disappointing because after it went on for a while, I went to them a few times, as did my wife, asking if they could keep the dogs under control, but they didn't seem to have any respect or care for anybody else around them. And when my wife said something, she said it in a way that she wouldn't lose face. She cared more about how they felt about her as opposed to how she felt about not being able to sleep. And it was a bit of a reality check that I wasn't expecting. So the dogs were an ongoing problem. And then probably 3 months after they moved in, there was a second incident, as I like to call it. They had some huge speakers outside the house that they'd set up for karaoke. And that was going on for about a week apparently, celebrating some family thing that they were doing. And every night they were blaring at it at full whack. It was so annoying, but we put up with it for 2 weeks because that was what we thought we needed to do and it would go away. It did die down, but then a week later the speakers were outside again, and then his friends were coming over and they're getting drunk together and playing music in the driveway. It wasn't every night, but 3 to 4 times a week. Then they started grilling things outside as well, and of course they lit the charcoal and the smoke went straight into our house. The smoke would blow straight in, so we could no longer leave the windows or the doors open, and we had to sit inside with the aircon on all the time when we were there because of what they were doing. They smoked as well, chain smoking, and that was the worst thing that ever happened to us. It was so annoying. And while I didn't mind that they had a barbecue occasionally once a week like normal people did, it was every single day. Every single day they were cooking with charcoal and grilling meat right next to the boundary wall. And it was as if they were completely oblivious to how this was affecting our lives next door. The logical step, of course, was to go to the developer or the manager, and the manager of the area. We told them what was going on and asked them to enforce the rules, but they never did. They went to speak to them, but it was more of a quiet word just to appease us, and they never enforced things seriously, and nothing changed. After I complained to the management, the music got worse, as if they were doing it on purpose. They had taken it inside, but they were always playing the music, and the bass was what made it worse. You could feel it in the walls of the house, and you could feel it when you were lying down at night, and it would be ongoing all the time. When I say all the time, I don't mean every second, but every week you could guarantee that you're going to be disturbed at least 3 times. I tried to go and speak to them, to get them to understand that this wasn't acceptable behaviour when you're living in close proximity to other people, but I would go and ring the bell and they'd never answer, even though I knew they were there. My wife told me to ignore it, saying it wasn't a good idea to cause problems with the neighbours, but they were the one causing the problems by being so selfish. She even suggested I buy some earplugs in my own house that I was paying a mortgage for, and I couldn't believe she said that. It was insane to think that this was happening. I was working so hard, paying for the mortgage on the house in her name, and I was tired after work and unable to relax properly, because even when they weren't playing music and the dogs weren't barking, I was on edge all the time that it was going to start up at any time. Time went on, and then his elderly parents moved into the house. That in itself wasn't a problem, but because they were from the countryside, they brought their countryside ways with them, and they started burning rubbish right next to the boundary wall. In Thailand, they have proper rubbish collection, which I think we were paying 50 baht every month for, and the truck came 3 times a week to take the rubbish away. All you had to do was leave it outside. But no, his parents decided that they were going to burn it in the garden. This was mainly garden waste, not necessarily plastic, so it didn't get as bad as it could have been, but still, it was awful, and he wasn't telling his parents that this wasn't allowed. We weren't in the countryside, in the middle of nowhere, we were in Bangkok, and it was part of the rules that meant that they couldn't do this. But again, management said they would send a letter, and then the burning stops for a few weeks and then it starts again. Only this time, his parents were burning at night, thinking nobody would notice. So he would wake at 2 in the morning because of barking dogs, and then he'd be choking on the smoke coming into the house because they were burning again. I thought the whole thing was the most hypocritical act of lunacy I'd ever witnessed. The guy there, he had a Mercedes, he wore great clothes, he sent his kids to private schools, and they acted like sophisticated and successful people, yet they still behaved as if they were in a village where rules didn't matter. He had the latest phone, the latest accessories, all the Western consumer goods that he loved showing off, yet he had no consideration for the people living next door. Most people just seemed to accept it, and while they would complain to each other, nobody did anything, and my wife, no chance. She didn't like it, but she wasn't going to say anything about it. The worst part of the whole thing was my wife's reaction to it. It was driving me to drink, quite literally. She talked about how she'd grown up with things like this, and she was just saying that's how some Thai people were and you couldn't change them, and it was better to accept it and move on. I couldn't understand her mentality. I said if they wanted to act like this, they should have stayed where they came from instead of acting, on the one hand, like they were one thing, and then on the other hand, like they were something else. It wasn't like everybody else around liked what they were doing. They just accepted it because it appeared to be what people did. I was paying a mortgage on this house and I couldn't even enjoy it, but she always refused to confront them. She told me I was making things worse, causing her to lose face, and I was also making enemies with people that we would live next door to for many years. I got that, but I never understood why she tried to defend these people, saying that maybe they didn't realise how loud it was, or maybe they didn't think that people 3 houses away could hear it. Maybe they were burning the rubbish because the bins were full. But these were just things she was saying that I couldn't get behind. The thing that got me the most, though, was how she seemed to be really impressed about what they had. She'd always comment about his wife's new handbag when she saw it, saying how much that must have cost, and then how she'd show up with watches that were fancy and expensive, and then turn up with a brand new BMW, and she went on about that for days. It was like what they had meant that they could behave like that, because they had more than us. For her, they had more than us, so their behaviour was acceptable. And I really started to resent my wife for that. I was there working as hard as I could as a teacher, putting most of the money into the house that I was paying extra for, and it was in her name. I was working extra hours as well, and she's there looking up to the people next door like they're better than her. We argued about that constantly. I'd be home from work, really stressed, looking for some peace, and then I'd hear the dogs and the music and the smoke. It was a 3-in-1 when that happened, and that happened more often than once. And she just said, turn the TV up louder. And I kept saying, we needed to sort it out, but she didn't want to sort it out. I wanted to move, but then she said she didn't want to move, and life was becoming unbearable, and I hated it. The problem is, things continue to get worse. I'm still paying the mortgage, and that really hurts. And every month I have to pay it because if I don't, then we can't be there, and I didn't have a choice. All my money was in this house, and I wanted to pay it off and start saving some money, maybe working another 5 to 6 years and then retire, but it was all going wrong. Then they got some chickens. His parents got some chickens, and this was meant to be a modern housing estate with rules, apparently. They only had 2 of them, and I don't know why the dogs didn't dispatch them quickly, but it was just that annoyance of them hopping over the garden wall and being in our garden. I couldn't believe that this was allowed to go on in the estate, and then when we complained, or when I complained, should I say, they didn't do anything about it. Then he bought a cockerel. His father did, and he's allowing this to go on, and he doesn't look like the sort of person who would allow this behaviour, given how much he's got and what sort of person he seems to be. He just shrugged it off, saying it's a natural alarm clock. It was awful, and I wanted to do something about it, but the problem is I didn't know what to do because my wife was just putting up with it. I find I'm getting angrier every single day, and I'm starting to shout at students for only minor things, whereas before I was always very level-headed, and every single thing my wife did started to annoy me. I think it was the fact that she didn't seem to care about what was going on next door that made me notice other things about her that I didn't understand. For example, I'd be the one working, coming back late in the evening, and the sink would be full of dishes that she hadn't cleaned, as if she was too busy watching TV. And things like that, they didn't bother me before, but now they did. And that was when the day came that I really lost it, when I made the remark about the buffalo. They were having another party outside. His friends were there getting drunk, and they were grilling like they did every day, and that's when I blew it. I shouted at him, and although I felt shame afterwards, I actually did it because I lost control, but it wasn't who I was. I'd become a person because of everything that had happened, and I was having such a difficult time that I turned into this person that I never wanted to become. And not only that, I felt like I was trapped because everything I had was going into this house. I'm very ashamed to admit to what I did next, but after that incident where I shouted at him, I thought it was only right to start taking my own petty revenge. One night when I was very drunk, and also very angry, I went outside and relieved myself over the wall, and the one that separated our 2 houses. At the time I was laughing, thinking this was great, but in the morning I just felt disgust that I'd actually done it. But I did it again the following week, and I kept doing it because it was the only thing I could think of doing to get something back against this lunacy that was going on right next door. Then I started throwing rubbish over. I sometimes found rubbish that was in my garden from their place, and I'm throwing it back over the wall. And if I had anything, I'd throw that over as well, just to try to claw something back from them for ruining my life. I knew it was really childish, even pathetic behaviour from a guy in his 50s who was meant to be a respectable teacher, but it did give me some small amount of satisfaction, like I was fighting back, although I knew deep down it was worthless. I felt a huge contradiction in myself, and that was eating me alive. I'd come to Thailand because I really loved the country. I loved the people and the culture. I could learn the language, and I was getting by with it quite well, and I'd made friends that were Thai, I'd married a Thai, and I tried to integrate myself as best as I could into society and be as respectful as I could be. But there I was acting like that because I was driven to it. The nice neighbours on the other side, they were too polite to say anything. I could tell they didn't like it, but it didn't bother them the same way, and I never understood. It was always the "my in the right" attitude that you got in Thailand, like, never mind, don't worry about it. But it was ruining me. I never understood that expat who went to Thailand and who stayed there and who hated everything about it and who complained constantly, who thought everyone was out to get them. But I started to understand why people get into that position in the first place. I loved Thailand and everything about it, but I just didn't understand how this kind of behaviour was allowed to go unchecked in what was meant to be a civilised housing development where people were paying good money to live in these houses. I will never understand. To the other side of him, he didn't have anybody else. It was the end of the development. And across the road, while they could still hear, it wasn't as bad as we had it. It was an awful life, and it was becoming so bad, I wished I'd never left Australia in the first place. To make things even worse, at this point, me and my wife were not even talking anymore. I mean, barely talking. I'd come home from work and she'd go to bed early, and I'd stay up drinking. I even started smoking again. That was something I gave up before I even left Australia, and I was just angry all the time. Whereas before, we were used to spending weekends together. We'd go to the mall, we'd go out for a meal, and sometimes we'd go away for the weekend. Now she was going to visit her parents in Buriram, or she was going out with friends, and that was it. She just wanted to get away from me. The problem was I wanted to get away from everything, but I couldn't because I was so heavily invested, and the house started feeling like a prison. I used to be an optimistic person who was full of happiness and hope, and I was kind, I was friendly, and I was always able to make friends. Now I was just angry all the time, and I was hating the person I was becoming. Then, one night, when I was drinking, another fire starts. The music starts, and a few hours later, the music dies down. But the fire is left smouldering all night, and the smoke is coming into the house all the time, and it was as if they had no idea how much anguish it was causing. All those years of me saving when I was working hard in China, and for the first months and years I was in Thailand, saving for the deposit on this house. We still owed money on the house, and I didn't have any other money. It was so awful being in this position, living next to such inconsiderate people who had no idea how to exist in a civilized society. There were rules. They weren't allowed to do that, but they weren't enforced. They'd get warnings, but they'd continue and nothing was done about it. How it should have been was, you break the rules once, you get a warning. Twice, you get another warning. 3 times, you have your house confiscated. That's how it should be, and then he'd quickly stop it. But that wasn't going to happen. It was just a position of hopelessness, and it was completely wearing me down. As the weeks and months dragged on, my mental health was ruined. I wasn't sleeping properly. Maybe I got 3 to 4 hours a night if I was lucky. And that meant I started to make more mistakes at work. I forgot to submit some exam papers once, and then I showed up at the wrong classroom, and I'd never done something like that before. The head teacher did call me in for a chat, asking if I needed any time off or if I needed any help with anything. And while I just said it was fine and I was tired, I could tell that she wasn't believing me. I could see that she thought something was wrong and I wasn't admitting it. I was starting to think about just leaving the place altogether, going back to Australia and just accepting that I'd spent so many years wasting my life. But the thought of that also scared me because I wanted to live where I was without these constant distractions next door. The mortgage payments were always due, the car payments were due, but I was close to paying off the car, and that was something at least. My wife didn't understand that I was paying for this and I was trapped there, and it was making my life a living misery. It was also very annoying because the management company took monthly fees in order to maintain the development. That was for the security and the pool and the gym and the landscaping, but it was also meant to make sure people stuck to the rules. They just didn't seem to care that people weren't sticking to the rules. It was dreadful. I always used to say that this would never happen back in Australia because people wouldn't behave like that, and if they did, it would be stopped. I started to dislike even being in Thailand now because everything that I didn't like, which was only small things, was amplified beyond proportions by what was happening where I was living. And there was still over a decade left on the mortgage. It was so difficult, and I wouldn't have wished it on anybody. That house had become every single thing wrong with my life. It was meant to be my dream home. It was meant to be the culmination of all those years of hard work, but it became nothing more than a daily reminder of every single bad decision I'd made. I'd moved to Thailand, I'd got married, I put everything in her name. We chose a development that looked great, and we'd been together for a long time at this point, quite a long time. When I thought about all those years I'd worked in China, saving every last bit of money that came in, the strict saving, living in Bangkok when I was there, all the money I'd saved so hard that was used for a deposit. But it was useless. The mortgage payments were endless, and while I'd already paid the car off, I was still working just to try to pay for this house, but I didn't want to be there. I also blamed my wife because she didn't support me. She didn't try to do anything to get the situation better. She just put up with every single thing that they did like it was nothing. Tolerating their behaviour was her normal, but to me it wasn't. It was awful, and I hated her because of it. The final straw, that one came not very long after this. When I'd been at school working late for a parent-teacher conference, I had to come home very exhausted around 9 p.m. There were about 30 people in the neighbours' garden. The music was rattling our windows, and of course there was smoke coming over from all the barbecues they had. More than one, and it was going into the house. I just walked in, and my wife was there, sat watching TV with the volume turned right up and the curtains closed, as if nothing was wrong. When I asked her why she hadn't warned me that this was going on, she just shrugged, saying it wouldn't make any difference. And that's when I completely snapped. I walked into their garden and I started screaming. I was screaming, not saying anything, just screaming as loud as I could. And I started breaking things. I pushed over a few flower pots and they broke, and I grabbed one of their chickens and threw it down. I was also screaming for 2 minutes probably without stopping, and everyone stops and looks, but the music's still playing. And then he pushes me, and I fell to the ground. By this point, my wife came out looking horrified, and it looks like he wants to start fighting me, not understanding that he's the most selfish person the world has ever seen. Before he had a chance to strike me, I left his garden, went back into my house and told my wife that I never want to see her again. I walked upstairs, packed a bag with a few bits of clothing, my computer, and I left everything behind. I think she was quite shocked that I was doing it. I jumped in the car and drove away. I went to a hotel first, and then I just tried to let it sink in and calm down, to try to think if this was the right thing to do. She didn't try to call me that evening, but the following morning she did, and she just said, "I think you better go." I knew there and then that I had to go, and I just left the house for her and the mortgage for her to worry about. I boarded a plane that very day back to Australia with nothing apart from the money I managed to sell my car for, knowing that I'd wasted all those years, knowing I'd saved money for the house, and knowing that it was ruined by the inconsiderate behaviour of a few people, and knowing that my wife didn't have my back. It plagued me, and I wasn't able to get back to work for a whole year, just trying to get back into a normal mental state. One thing I did appreciate was the serenity of being in Australia. People have barbecues, of course they do. People have parties, of course they do. But these are rare events, and you're informed well in advance that someone's having a party, and you're invited as well if you want to be, and it's so much more civilized. It's so much easier to be there. It's just a shame that things are so expensive. I did start working again as a teacher, but I don't have any hopes of any sort of retirement, and it's taken me a long time to come to terms with it. My biggest mistake was investing in that house, because if we stayed renting, we could have moved, and I would probably have still been with my wife, and probably still had my money. But there's no use saying what if.